killer, Whitechapel offered an abundance of vulnerable, easy targets.
This is probably the only serial killer case that I can think of where you can walk all the crime scenes in less than 2 hours. All these crimes have occurred within 1 mile radius.
This environment clearly suited the Ripper's purposes. But was he what criminal psychologists call a poacher, someone who came from outside Whitechapel just to hunt? Or was he a marauder, attacking within his own community? Laura turns to a mapping technique called geographic profiling. It's used by law enforcement agencies around the world to interpret crime scene locations. Geoprofiling was invented by Dr. Kim Rossmo of the University of Texas. He's an ex-cop and a mathematician, and some years ago he spotted that it's possible to use crime locations to identify where the perpetrator has his base, his home.
Most criminals operate out of their home in terms of their search for criminal targets. Criminals commit crimes close to where they live, but not too close. They're affected by concerns over anonymity and not wanting to hunt in an area where they might be identified.
Dr. Rossmo uses a formula based on data from dozens of solved cases. It interprets crime sites and key features of the area, homes, roads, public spaces. He then calculates where the offender comes from.
We used a computer program to do upwards of 1 million calculations to determine the most likely area.
It produces a map where color indicates probability. The offender's home is least likely to be in the black areas, most likely to be in the red. Given the things all took place within 1 square mile, it should be possible for Dr. Rossmo to pinpoint the street where the police of 1888 ought to have started their hunt. While Laura results of the geographic profile, she looks at the circumstances of the second killing. It happened 9 days after Polly's body was found, and only half a mile away, in Hanbury Street. The victim's name was Annie Chapman. In 1888, this built Shoreditch Town Hall housed a coroner's court. It heard the details of the Ripper's crimes. Today, Laura's come here to talk to Neil Sheldon. He studied the victims' lives, and according to him, Annie Chapman's life was on a downward spiral.
Could you just tell me a bit more about that, Neil?
Yes, they all come from very ordinary working class backgrounds. Only Annie Chapman possibly came from a slightly better off background.
Her husband died 18 months ago now. After that, she rather gave up.
They lived a very ordinary life together. John had got some work with a gentleman in Bond Street. He worked for as a coachman, but unfortunately Annie had apparently been stealing from this person, and so they lost their jobs. At this time, it was more than likely that they started to drink.
She'd certainly had enough that night.
Right, so that was quite typical, and we certainly know that she was also a commercial sex worker or a prostitute.
Yes, she resorted to that on occasions, yes.
The yard where Annie was killed doesn't exist anymore. But to understand what happened, Laura needs to build a mental picture of the crime scene. She consults photographs and contemporary drawings. A model marks the way that the body was positioned.
Imagine that this is 29 Hanbury Street, and behind us is a row of 3-storey Victorian terraced houses.
At around 6 a.m. on the morning of the 8th of September, John Davis, a wagon driver, came down the stairs of number 29. He was leaving for work. He saw that the back door was slightly ajar. He went to investigate.
The head was 6 inches in front of the bottom step. The left arm lay across the left breast. The legs were drawn up, the feet resting on the ground, and the knees turned outward.
My initial thoughts on this scene are that it's not too dissimilar from Polly Nichols, the way that the victim has been left, certainly in an exposed way.
The cut on Annie Chapman's neck was that it almost severed her head. Part of her uterus was missing, her intestine drawn out and thrown up over her left shoulder. One witness from the scene described its effect.
Every person who had seen the body looked afraid, as if they wanted to run away.
There are some things that are purely functional. For example, over the victim, trying to stop her from screaming, incapacitating her in the quickest time possible. But there are certainly other things that he's doing that are peculiar to him, that he gains a form of enjoyment. These things are unique to that particular offender. It's certainly a conscious decision to actually open up someone's intestine, remove part of it and take what we think, some of it with him, the uterus, and place the other part of it up by the top of the victim's head.
Laura sees signs that even while he was killing, the Ripper was thinking about the consequences. He would generate shock and fear, and that was part of the thrill.
The body has been displayed intentionally and left in that way for a purpose. He's interested in people's reaction and the impact of what he's done.
He may have been calculating, planning. But he'd also put himself in a situation where the chance of being caught was very high. No fewer than 17 people lived at 29 Hanbury Street, coming and going at all hours. He could easily have been disturbed.
When you know that it's a very busy area that he's chosen to attack the victim and indeed the victims in, it's certainly telling us that he is willing to take a high risk.
This tells Laura about the Ripper's self-control. He either can't resist the need to kill, regardless of what might happen to him, or he is disciplined, confident, weighing up the odds and playing them. It's Annie Chapman's behavior which points to the answer. She almost certainly went with him of her own accord. If she'd been forced, if there'd been a struggle, it would have been heard. She probably thought he was a customer. He must have looked like a man who would do her no harm. He must have put her at her ease. The police of 1888 thought they were looking for an obvious lunatic, someone more animal than man. But the killer Laura sees doesn't fit any of the stereotypes.
The off-the-shelf profile would state that this offender has low interpersonal skills, cannot communicate with women, would not have a relationship with women. I just don't buy into that. That's not something that I've seen over the 10 years of working violent crime. A lot of these offenders do have relationships with women.
It appears that the Ripper managed to conceal what he was until the last second. To Laura, the point when sex became murder, when he showed his true intentions to his victim, is when he revealed most about himself. This moment will now become her focus. Jack the Ripper knew what he was doing, so Laura needs to know, in detail.
Violence is a choice. He's chosen to do that, to express himself in that way. And in the cold light of day, we're trying to make sense of what he's done.
She turns to Peter Dean. He's a coroner and a police surgeon for a division of London that includes Whitechapel. If the Ripper struck today, it would be on Peter Dean's patch. As an expert witness, his job is the investigation of wounds. And by looking at what happened across all the killings, he's able to build a picture of how the Ripper claimed a victim. He breaks an attack down into distinct phases: controlling, killing, and mutilating.
In a sense, he's got three things to do, and the first two have to be achieved quite quickly. He's got to overpower the victim.
In a short space of time.
A very short space of time, and the evidence seems to be, certainly for some of the murders, that he did that by asphyxiation.